Abandoned dog leads rescuers to a hidden cave. What they found inside will break your heart. Help. Someone help me. The frantic shout came from the cliffs near the old highway. Rachel Carter, a 27-year-old volunteer at the local animal shelter, sprinted toward the sound, her heart pounding. The steep trail ahead was notorious for accidents, but she pushed forward, clutching the flashlight she always carried. At the edge of the path she froze. A scruffy, mud-covered dog stood in the middle of the trail, barking sharply toward the drop-off. Its ribs jutted out and its fur was matted, but its focus was unyielding. Is someone down there? Rachel called out, shining her flashlight into the darkness below. The barking intensified. Okay boy, I'll follow. She edged toward the dog, careful not to startle it. The animal hesitated, then turned and trotted ahead, glancing back every few steps to make sure she was following. The trail narrowed, forcing Rachel to duck under low-hanging branches. The barking stopped abruptly. She caught up to the dog, which now stood beside a rock formation. Behind it was a small opening, almost hidden by overgrown bushes and debris. Is this what you wanted to show me? She asked, kneeling. The dog whimpered, pawing at the rocks near the entrance. A strange smell, stale and earthy, wafted from the gap. Rachel's stomach churned. She shone her flashlight inside and gasped. A blanket lay crumpled in the corner of what appeared to be a small cave. Beside it was a pile of empty cans and a plastic water bottle. Scrawled on the wall in jagged black letters was a message. Don't forget me. Her voice caught in her throat. Who was here? She whispered, glancing at the dog. It stared back at her, unblinking. Pulling out her phone, she dialed 911. This is Rachel Carter. I think I've found, I don't know, a campsite or something in the cliffs near the old highway. Someone might need help. The operator responded calmly, but Rachel barely heard the words. Her eyes were fixed on the message on the wall, her mind racing. The dog nudged her arm as if to say, don't stop now. Rachel paced nervously near the cave's entrance, her phone still clutched tightly in her hand. The dispatcher had promised to send someone, but with the narrow trails and remote location, it could take time. The dog, however, wasn't waiting. It pawed at the ground again, then trotted a few steps down another unmarked path. Where are you going? She murmured, unsure if she should follow. But something in the dog's behavior, its urgency, its strange persistence, compelled her to move. She shoved her phone into her pocket and tightened her grip on the flashlight. The path was uneven, littered with loose stones and overgrown weeds. It didn't look like anyone had used it in years. But the dog moved with certainty, weaving through the dense brush and stopping occasionally to glance back at her. The further they went, the heavier Rachel's chest felt. She wasn't sure if it was the steep climb or the weight of what she'd found back at the cave. The message on the wall played over and over in her head. Don't forget me. About 20 minutes in, she spotted something. A small, makeshift pile of stones marked the end of the path, forming a crude cairn. The dog barked once and sat beside it as if waiting for her to catch up. What is this? She whispered, crouching near the stones. Her fingers brushed against a scrap of fabric sticking out from beneath the pile. Slowly she pulled it free, a torn sleeve from a jacket, stained with dirt and faint streaks of what looked like dried blood. Her stomach turned, and her hands trembled as she held the fabric. This wasn't just someone camping in the cliffs. Something had gone horribly wrong. She scanned the ground around her, searching for more clues, but the cairn was the only distinct marker in the area. The dog whined softly, its head low to the ground. Rachel's voice cracked as she spoke to it. Who did this? Were they with you? The sound of footsteps behind her made her jump. She whipped around, the flashlight beam catching a familiar face. Rachel. Officer Sam Rivers called out. We got your call. What's going on out here? Her voice shook as she held up the fabric. I think someone was trying to leave a message. But I don't know if we're too late. Officer Rivers knelt beside Rachel, his expression tightening as he examined the torn sleeve. This doesn't look good, he muttered, pulling out a small notebook to jot down details. Rachel gestured toward the cairn. The dog led me here. It doesn't seem like this was random. And there's more. Back at the cave I found supplies and a message. Someone was living there. The officer straightened, scanning the surrounding area with a sharp eye. We'll need to process the site properly. For now, don't touch anything else. The fabric might be evidence. The dog barked again, breaking the tension. It darted a few paces away, circling an area of disturbed dirt nearby. Rachel hesitated, but Officer Rivers gestured for her to stay back as he approached. Using his flashlight, he illuminated a shallow indentation in the ground. His breath hitched. Looks like someone tried to dig here. He crouched, brushing away the loose dirt with gloved hands, but the effort revealed only rocks and roots. Rachel's stomach churned as she watched. What does it mean? Could they still be nearby? Rivers stood, shaking his head. Hard to say. If this was recent, there's a chance. But it's more likely they moved on, or worse. His words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The flashlight flickered and Rachel slapped it against her palm. The sudden silence between them felt unbearable. We can't just stop here, she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. There's someone out there who might need us. Rivers nodded, pulling his radio from his belt. I'll call in a search team. We'll comb the area. In the meantime, you should head back to the main trail. I'm not leaving, Rachel insisted. This dog knows something. It's been leading me the whole way. If there's a chance it can help, I'm staying. Rivers hesitated, then sighed. Fine. But stay close. And no heroics. The dog wagged its tail briefly as if understanding the renewed focus. It trotted ahead again, this time leading them toward a cluster of low trees. Rachel followed, her mind racing with unanswered questions. As they walked, she couldn't shake the image of the message scrawled in the cave. Don't forget me. It wasn't just a plea, it was a warning. Someone out there had wanted to be found. The cluster of trees opened into a small clearing, barely visible under the canopy of branches above. The dog stopped at the edge, its ears perked as it sniffed the air. Rachel and Officer Rivers exchanged a glance before stepping forward cautiously. Rachel's flashlight beam swept across the area, landing on a crude structure fashioned from broken branches and an old tarp. It sagged to one side as though abandoned in a hurry. Rivers motioned for her to stay back as he approached, his boots crunching softly on the ground. Looks like another campsite, he said, pulling back part of the tarp. Inside, Rachel could see more discarded items. A battered backpack, a rusted can opener, and a worn pair of sneakers. Rivers knelt to inspect the contents, carefully removing the backpack. Rachel couldn't stay still. She moved closer, her eyes scanning the makeshift shelter for any signs of life. Her gaze landed on a small notebook peeking out from under the sneakers. Wait, she said, pointing. That might be important. Rivers picked up the notebook, flipping it open. The pages were smudged and wrinkled, but the writing was legible. It wasn't a diary, it was a collection of desperate notes. Food almost gone. Too cold to stay here much longer. If you find this, please help the dog. He saved me. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. They cared about the dog, she said softly, glancing down at the animal sitting obediently nearby. It met her gaze with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Rivers nodded grimly. Whoever this was, they were in bad shape. And they trusted this dog to lead someone to them. The weight of the situation pressed down on Rachel. Do you think they made it? That they got somewhere safe? Before Rivers could answer, the dog barked sharply, snapping their attention to a trail leading deeper into the forest. It was more overgrown than the previous paths, barely distinguishable from the surrounding brush. It's not giving up, Rachel said, her voice steadier now. And neither should we. Rivers exhaled heavily, tucking the notebook into his pocket. Fine. But we need to be careful. Whoever we're looking for might not be in the condition we're hoping. Rachel didn't reply. She only gripped her flashlight tighter and followed as the dog led them further into the unknown. The forest grew denser as they followed the dog. The trail, if it could even be called that, was little more than a series of faint indentations in the dirt. Rachel pushed back low-hanging branches, her legs aching from the uneven terrain. The air felt colder here, the silence broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional bark from their four-legged guide. What kind of person survives out here? She asked, her voice low but heavy with curiosity. Someone desperate, Rivers replied without turning. His tone was clipped, but Rachel could sense the weight of his words. Or resourceful. Maybe both. The dog stopped suddenly, its nose to the ground. It sniffed furiously, then pawed at something buried in the dirt. Rachel crouched beside it, brushing the leaves away to reveal a crumpled piece of fabric. She carefully pulled it free, revealing an old jacket, its sleeves torn and stained. This matches the sleeve we found earlier, she said, holding it up for Rivers to inspect. He nodded grimly. Looks like we're still on their trail. But why leave all this behind? Were they running? Injured? Rachel didn't respond. Her attention was fixed on the jacket's inner lining, where a small, tattered photo had been tucked away. She unfolded it carefully, revealing the image of a young woman holding the very dog now standing beside her. The sight hit her like a punch to the gut. This dog, it was their companion, she said softly. Whoever we're looking for, this dog isn't just a guide. It's their lifeline. The dog whined softly as if understanding the significance of the discovery. It nudged her arm with its nose, urging her to move forward. Rivers glanced at the photo before handing it back. We've got to be close. But let's keep our guard up. People don't leave trails like this unless they're in trouble, or trying to avoid it. The dog barked again, this time more insistently. Rachel stood, stuffing the photo into her pocket as they pressed on. Minutes later, they came upon another clearing. In the center was a fire pit, its ashes long cold. Around it were remnants of a camp, a tin cup, a roll of gauze, and a tattered sleeping bag. Rachel's heart sank. They were hurt, she whispered, pointing to the blood-stained gauze. Rivers crouched to inspect the items. This wasn't abandoned long ago. We need to call in a search team now. As he reached for his radio, the dog growled low, its ears pinned back. Rachel froze, scanning the shadows. Something's out there, she murmured. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the stillness unnerving. Whatever was ahead, Rachel knew they were about to find out. The dog's growl lingered in the air, low and guttural, a warning as sharp as a scream. Rachel tightened her grip on the flashlight, its weak beam darting across the darkened tree line. Stay still, Rivers commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached for his sidearm, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the shadows. Rachel swallowed hard, every nerve in her body alive with tension. The silence pressed down on them, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the cold wind. The dog took a step forward, hackles raised, its focus locked on something unseen. Then a sound, a faint, shuffling noise coming from the far side of the clearing. Rachel's heart leapt into her throat. Could it be them? She asked, her voice trembling. Could be, Rivers replied, though his grip on his weapon suggested otherwise. He motioned for her to stay behind him as he crept toward the sound. The dog barked once, a short, sharp signal, before sprinting ahead. Rachel's instincts screamed to follow, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. She watched as Rivers disappeared into the trees, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Seconds felt like hours. Then a voice called out, a whisper hoarse and cracked. Help, please? Rachel's heart nearly stopped. Ignoring Rivers's earlier warnings, she bolted toward the sound. The dog was ahead of her, its tail wagging frantically as it pawed at a dense thicket of branches. Over here, she shouted, pulling at the foliage with trembling hands. Her flashlight revealed a figure curled up on the ground, barely visible beneath a tangle of leaves and debris. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her clothes torn and filthy. She clutched her side, wincing as she tried to lift her head. The words she spoke were barely audible. The dog he brought you. Rachel dropped to her knees, tears welling in her eyes. We've got you, she said, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. You're safe now. Rivers appeared moments later, his expression a mix of relief and urgency. She's alive, but she's in bad shape, he said, reaching for his radio. We need medical assistance immediately. As Rivers relayed their location, Rachel took the woman's hand gently. We're here, she said softly. The dog lay beside them, its body pressed against the woman's, as though guarding her from the forest that had nearly claimed her life. For the first time that night, Rachel allowed herself to hope. The woman's breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of her chest fragile and uneven. Rachel wrapped her jacket around the frail figure, her hands trembling as she tried to offer warmth. The dog sat vigil beside her, its gaze unwavering as though willing her to hold on. Stay with us, Rachel whispered, leaning closer. Help is on the way. The woman's cracked lips moved, her voice barely audible. I didn't think anyone would come. Rachel fought back tears. We're here now. You're not alone anymore. Rivers, crouching nearby, assessed the woman's condition with a practiced eye. She's dehydrated and likely hypothermic. We'll need to keep her conscious until the paramedics arrive. The woman's eyes flicked to Rachel. I tried to leave signs, for someone to find me, she said haltingly. I didn't want to die out here. Not alone. Rachel squeezed her hand gently. You did everything right. The dog led us to you. A faint smile touched the woman's lips. Buddy? He never left. Even when I couldn't move anymore. Buddy, Rachel repeated, glancing at the dog. The name suited him, a loyal companion who had refused to give up on his person. She reached out to scratch behind his ears, and for the first time, the dog allowed himself a moment of calm, his tail thumping softly against the ground. The woman's gaze shifted, her expression clouding. There's something else, she murmured. I heard voices, not far from here. I thought it was help, but she trailed off, her face tightening with fear. Rivers leaned in. What kind of voices? Angry, she said weakly. They didn't sound safe. That's why I hid. I thought they'd find me if I moved. Rivers's jaw tightened. He glanced at Rachel, his voice low and urgent. We might not be alone out here. Rachel's stomach clenched. Do you think it's... Let's not assume anything yet, Rivers interrupted. He stood, scanning the forest with his flashlight. But we need to stay alert. Help will be here soon and we'll get her out safely. The woman's grip on Rachel's hand tightened, her eyes pleading. Don't let them find me. Rachel nodded, her resolve hardening. We won't. The dog let out a soft growl, its ears perked toward the darkness. Whatever dangers still lurked, Rachel knew one thing for certain. Buddy wouldn't let anything happen to them without a fight. The weight of the woman's words settled heavily in the air. Don't let them find me. It was a plea, a desperate cry for safety, and Rachel felt every ounce of that fear in her bones. The dark woods seemed to close in around them, the only sound now the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Rivers remained tense, his hand resting on the handle of his sidearm, his eyes scanning the periphery with practiced vigilance. We're not taking any chances, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Stay low, stay quiet. Rachel nodded, though her mind raced. The woman's warning, coupled with the growing sense of unease in the air, pushed her into a heightened state of alert. She watched as the dog stood, its nose twitching, ears swiveling in every direction. Buddy? Rachel whispered. The dog's growl was low but clear, a warning. Before she could process the thought, a voice sliced through the quiet, chilling in its bluntness. You think we wouldn't find you, huh? Rachel froze, heart hammering in her chest. The voice was gruff, low, but unmistakably close. She looked at Rivers, whose hand was now tightly gripping his radio, ready for any command. We've got company, he said in a clipped tone. He shifted, positioning himself between Rachel and the emerging threat. Another figure stepped out from the shadows, a man tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket that blended into the night. He wasn't alone. A second man appeared, his face obscured by a hood, his hands tucked deep into his pockets. The woman, still clinging to Rachel's hand, shuddered. Please don't, her voice cracked, a fragile plea that only strengthened Rachel's resolve. The first man took a step forward, his expression unreadable. It's too late for hiding now. Rivers held his ground, his stance defensive. You need to leave. Now. Or what? The man sneered, his eyes scanning Rivers and Rachel with a dangerous gleam. The dog barked sharply, stepping protectively in front of the woman. Its stance was rigid, its tail stiff and high. Rachel's breath caught as the second man took a step toward the dog, his hand reaching for something at his belt. Back off, mutt, he growled. The woman gasped, trying to push herself up, but she winced in pain, falling back to the ground. No. Please don't hurt him. Rachel's heart sank. She could feel the tension in the air, could sense that these men were no ordinary threats. They were predators. Rivers took a slow step forward, his voice firm but calm. If you want to leave this place in one piece, I suggest you walk away. You won't get anything from us. The first man sneered, taking another step toward them. You don't understand. This dog? He stopped, glancing at his companion before lowering his voice. He's the one who led us to the woman. The dog growled louder, more menacing now, and Rachel felt a surge of fear and determination mix in her chest. She had to protect this woman, this dog, this fragile thread of hope in the woods. And she would not let these men tear it away. The tension thickened, a silent war between them and the unknown. Rivers was calm, his posture unwavering, but Rachel could feel the adrenaline rising in her chest. The men were closer now, their presence like a storm on the horizon. She couldn't let them hurt Buddy, couldn't let them take away the fragile chance at survival they'd all worked so hard for. Buddy stood firm, his low growl echoing through the night. Rachel could see the muscles in his body tense, his protective instincts running wild. She trusted him. The bond between them and the woman, the one formed through this shared fight for survival, was stronger than anything these strangers could bring. The first man glanced at his partner again, his eyes cold and calculating. I don't know why you're protecting that dog, he said, his voice sharp with frustration. But you're making a mistake. We're not leaving, Rachel replied, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. Not without the woman. And we're not going to let you hurt her, or him. Rivers stepped forward again, his expression hard. You can leave now or we can make you. The second man pulled something from his jacket. A knife, its blade glinting faintly in the beam of Rachel's flashlight. You really think you can stand against us? His voice was low, mocking. This isn't your fight, lady. Rachel's breath caught. The air felt too still, too quiet. The only sound was the rustling of the trees overhead and the soft, rhythmic panting of the dog. But then Buddy lunged forward, barking fiercely, his teeth bared. The first man staggered back, his eyes wide with shock, his hand reaching for something at his waist. In an instant, Rivers was on him, his hands grabbing the man's wrist, forcing the knife away. I warned you. Rachel barely had time to react before the second man rushed toward her, eyes wild with rage. Buddy growled louder, leaping in front of her, his body a shield. The man hesitated, stepping back, his hands raised in surprise. Stay back, Rachel commanded, her voice shaking but resolute. This dog is your only warning. The man's face twisted in anger, but before he could react further, the sound of distant sirens broke through the tension. The police backup had arrived. The men froze, exchanging a brief, calculating look. And with a final, contemptuous glance at Rachel and the others, they turned and disappeared back into the woods, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of danger. Rachel exhaled, her whole body shaking. She sank to her knees beside the woman, who was staring at her in awe. You saved us, she whispered, her voice breaking. Buddy stood by, his tail wagging as if to reassure her. Rachel couldn't help but smile, even through the exhaustion. The dog had been their protector, their guide, and now, in the quiet aftermath, their savior. As the sound of the approaching sirens grew louder, Rachel felt a weight lift off her shoulders. They had made it. The woman was safe. Buddy was safe. And in that moment, they had all found something they had been searching for in the darkest parts of the woods. Hope. As the forest quiets and the last echoes of danger fade into the night, we're left with one powerful truth. Sometimes the courage of a single soul, or a single dog, is all it takes to change everything. Buddy, loyal and fearless, showed us what it truly means to protect the ones we love, no matter the cost. But what about you? What would you do if you were faced with the same choices? Would you fight? Would you protect? If this story touched your heart, let us know. Like, comment, and share this video with those who need to hear it. Every share, every comment could help someone feel less alone, or inspire them to act when they're needed most. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Because here we believe in the power of stories that make us think, make us feel, and make us act. Don't miss the next chapter.